Well, welcome back. Glad to see you again. Guys, I gotta tell you, I am digging making these videos. It's been a while since I've had occasion to take a deep dive into a single book of the Bible like this. Really having a good time. So I hope that they've been interesting and helpful to you as well. Anyway, we've looked now at the two creation narratives. The way the book works from here is that in the remainder of the mythological section, chapters 1 to 11, we get three little episodes, little vignettes, that tell us what the world is like once human beings attempt to seize for themselves the divine responsibility of naming good and bad, and thereby are exiled from the center of God's life-giving energy. So there's a story of the first murder when Cain slays his brother Abel, so that's nice. Then there's the Noah's Ark story that you all know from Vacation Bible School or whatever. And there's the Tower of Babel. And then we finally get onto the real kind of narrative cycle of the book, starting in chapter 12. So we're going to look at all three of those little vignettes at some point, but we're going to work through them in reverse order. First Babel, then back through to the flood next week. Because sometimes it's easier to make sense of a story once you've kind of seen what comes next, right? Like when you go to a movie and it's like, oh, Bruce Willis was dead the whole time, you know? So we're going to do that, but then we're going to leave Cain and Abel aside for a little while. I'll circle back to them in a couple of weeks. Oh, and next week I'm going to show you something about the Noah's Ark story that I bet you've never, ever heard in all those years of Sunday school and BBS, even though it was right there under your nose the whole time. I'm getting ahead of myself. Today we are going to go to the Tower of Babel, chapter 11, if you're reading along. So, in fact, you can pause the video now and go ahead and read that chapter. Come back when you're done. Okay, so this is a story about how a group of people had a groundbreaking new technology, the brick, and they decided to build a city. At the center of it, a tower that reached up to the heavens. And God does not like this idea. So God comes down and, quote, confuses their language and scatters them across the face of the earth. This is one of the places where you can really see the mythic quality of these stories shine through. Remember, we define myth as a story about the way that things never were, but always are. You can almost imagine how a story like this might have come into being. And it's late at night, you're tucking your kid into bed, and they just won't go to sleep because so many questions are running through their little minds. So they start in, Daddy, why don't snakes have legs? Or, Mommy, why are there rainbows? Or, in this case, Daddy, why do people talk so many different languages? Well, let me tell you a story, right? But the real question to ask is, why is this particular myth placed in this collection? And why was it told the way it was? What were the compilers and editors trying to tell us? Well, to get to that, I think that we need to have in mind two things, at least, about the creation myths that came before. One that will be a refresher for you and one that might be new to you, and two things about the Tower of Babel story itself. So first, a little refresher. Remember, we said that the Garden of Eden, and by extension, the whole world, is a temple of God. That's important to keep in mind. Okay, now the new point. But I'll pose it as a question. What do you picture in your mind's eye when you think of the Garden of Eden? What kind of landscape is it? I ask my students this, and they often picture either a lush jungle or a big, wide-open, grassy prairie. That's not surprising. That's how the scene is most often painted. But it's wrong. Eden is a mountain, a temple mountain. Well, Joe, why do you say Eden is a mountain? So glad you asked. But it wasn't me who said it. It was the prophet Ezekiel. You were in Eden, the garden of God, on the holy mountain of God. But anyway, you can see it right there in the text of Genesis as well. Remember how we talked about the 4 rivers flowing out of the center of the garden, carrying the life-giving energy of God to the world? Well, there's only one kind of landscape in which 4 rivers can flow out from a center point. Okay, but if the Garden of Eden is a mountain, then why doesn't the author say so explicitly? I would suggest that's because for the original audience, that Eden was a mountain was a point that went without saying. It's such a common feature of mythologies throughout the ancient Near East, and even in the Fertile Crescent and Eastern Asia as well, that there's this cosmic mountain, which is both the cradle of creation and the place where heaven and earth interlock and overlap. You know, think of Mount Olympus in ancient Greece. The original audience of this story, as soon as we start talking about creation, would have just assumed that we're dealing with a cosmic mountain. The whole earth is the mountain temple of God. Okay, now, 2 things about the Tower of Babel story. Remember, that's what we're trying to get to. Why did the compilers and editors of Genesis give us this strange story where and in the way they did? First, you shouldn't imagine a modern tower, like the Eiffel Tower or the Washington Monument or something. The kind of towers that were common throughout the ancient Near East during this time, and thus the kind that the original audience of this story would have pictured, were called ziggurats, like increasingly narrowed stacks of terraces. Here's a reconstruction of one called the Ziggurat of Ur. Do you see it? What does it look like? Adam and Eve had been expelled from the Garden Temple Mountain because they chose to seize for themselves the divine power to name good and bad. Now, God has a plan for how to reconnect the world to their life-giving energy. That's what the next chapter, chapter 12, and really the rest of the book of Genesis is all about. But at Babel, the people said, no, that's okay. We'll create our own mountain, so high that heaven and earth touch. We'll seize for ourselves that divine power. It's a story as old as time, isn't it? Okay, final point. The title is a mistranslation. The word Babel is just the Hebrew word for Babylon, the capital city of the ancient empire of Babylonia. The same word everywhere else throughout the Hebrew Bible is translated as Babylon. The translators only transliterate it as Babel here in this passage because, well, mostly because it's become traditional at this point, but also because the author is making a little pun with the Hebrew word balal, which means to confuse, as in God confused their language. But you don't even pick up on that pun in the English, unless you're the kind of person who reads the footnotes. At any rate, in my estimation, this is just an egregious failure on the part of almost all modern English translations. Do you see why? Do you remember what we said the very first session about when the book of Genesis was written? It was when God's people were in captivity in Babylon. Right? So this is a deliberate dichotomy. Babylon is the mountain city whose birth represents the epitome of human hubris, the belief that we can seize control of God. The city which, in its attempt to do so, conquered and destroyed the Jewish people and waged war on the very mountain temple of God. And so we're presented with this very clear choice. There are 2 ways of life. One as a curator on the mountain of God's creation and a conduit of God's life-giving energy flowing out to the world, and the other in seizing power and control for ourselves on the mountain of our own creation. Okay, so next week we'll take a look at that wonderfully weird and eerie children's tale, Noah's Ark. Until then,